Great. So let's begin for today. I'm happy to see a lot of you making excellent progress. I hope you've been sharing that uplifted state of mind with people around you. Like I mentioned right at the beginning, uh, this practice is not meant to be a break in isolation, right? So it's not meant to be a small period of time where you can make yourself feel good. It is something we want to actively bring into the rest of our lives. So even with the current practice of sending goodwill to a friend, to other people, start bringing that into your daily life. Your walking meditation is already acting as a bridge. Great. So the first few days, we've spent some time talking about attentional skills while we're also obviously developing them in our practice. So the three attentional skills, being able to identify when our mind gets distracted or goes into a rabbit hole where it seems to have a mind of its own, right? So mindfulness, the skill remembering to observe how your attention moves from one thing to another. We practice it in our meditation and then we start bringing it into daily life. The second skill, once you realize, you identify that your mind is caught up in a distraction, in a rabbit hole. How do you get it out with the suitable application, harmonious practice? So the second skill of harmonious practice, the 6 R's, recognizing that your attention is caught up with a thought, being able to let that thought be, relax any tension and tightness in your mind that is binding your attention to that thought, and being able to smile and get your mind gently back to the object of meditation and using this as often as required. And yesterday we went more into the third skill, which is collectedness, which is being able to hold your mind with a wholesome object, with something that you intend to do, being able to keep it without having the desperation to run after other things, other distractions, other thoughts, other events that are happening in your awareness. So that is the third skill. We talked about collectedness. We also talked about how collectedness leads to states of mind known as jhanas, states that are deep, states that are stable, states that allow us to gain a lot of insight into the movement of mind's attention into the creation of mental phenomena. Today, we'll start the second phase of this retreat. We'll start with a few understanding how is it that human experience actually happens. So we've talked about the attentional part. We've talked about why paying attention to attention is important, why where your attention is actually determining the quality of your experience. But no matter where your attention is, there is a story happening there. Whether it is something you intend, whether it is something you don't intend, whether it is a distraction, whether it is a rabbit hole, whether it is your object of meditation, there are a lot of things happening. So today we'll start the next phase of the journey where we start understanding the actual occurrence of human experience, right? So what are the things that go into it? Today we will start with a basic part to kind of set up the next few days. So we'll talk about two things that come up a lot in the Buddha's teachings. Uh, before getting into that, I just want to make a comment about the way the Buddha approached this whole area, right? So yesterday we talked about the Four Noble Truths. We talked about the Buddha said, all I teach, only thing I teach is suffering and the end of suffering, understanding suffering and the end of suffering. And he presented his teaching in the form of a Four Noble Truths: the truth of suffering, the existence of dissatisfaction at different levels, the origin of suffering, which is craving, being attached personally to outcomes in a certain situation and predicating your happiness on those outcomes. So we have the origin of suffering, the samudaya, which is craving or tanha, or Trishna. And then we have the cessation of suffering. How do we come to the end of suffering? By elimination of craving, that which it is dependent on. This is called Dukkha Nirodha, cessation of suffering. And finally, the path that the Buddha gave, which is the Noble Eightfold Path. We will get to that, but we'll cover some more important territory so that it comes in context, right? Otherwise, it becomes a list and we don't really understand what that list is about, right? So we are covering important material from that list. So when we get there, we are able to place all of that together, see how it all fits together. So the Buddha's approach towards this whole thing, he started with the idea of recognizing that there is dissatisfaction, there is suffering, death is inevitable, aging is inevitable, health problems are inevitable, emotional conflicts are inevitable. He saw that. And his goal was to explore whether there is a end to this. Is there something that can put an end to this suffering, or is it an inescapable part of the human condition? And the approach he did, he tried a lot of different practices, very extreme practices. He was down to eating 1 grain of rice a day. So it subjected him to a lot of that. And eventually he did realize that there is a way to end suffering, and it isn't through extreme deprivation or austerity. And we'll come to that also later in the retreat about the idea of the middle path. But primarily, the Buddha had a very phenomenological approach to understanding things that are happening. So he said, okay, suffering is a phenomenon that we experience. So now let's start breaking it down. Let's see what is it that sustains it. How does it come about? What is, if it is dependent on one thing, what is that thing dependent on? What is the next? What is it dependent on? What is the next thing dependent on? So it's a kind of root cause analysis approach that the Buddha used to follow. You'll also, as we go through this retreat and as you spend in future, if you have the inclination, spend some time going through some of the material that the Buddha has talked about. So he has this habit, or he has this uh, way of presenting which involves a lot of classification of things that are happening, and root cause analysis, seeing what is dependent on what, and how can you reduce a problem to solving the next problem, solving the next problem, solving the next problem till you get to the root of it, right? So we'll see that approach in action. And to that extent, so we are starting with a set of classifications that the Buddha uses in his teachings, and we will start with understanding these today. And this will form the basis for our exploration of how experiences happen, how conceptions happen, how we attach meaning to different things in life, how one person differs from another, how the same situation can appear differently to different people, how with the same set of facts we may be subscribing to different narratives, how the same thing that gives you joy can give you sorrow or frustration another day, right? So we'll start unpacking that part. And today we'll set the base for that. Okay. There are two topics that I will talk about today. First is the sense basis. This will be quite brief, but there are a couple of important distinctions that I'd like to just touch upon. And then we'll talk about something called the 5 aggregates approach. So when we get there, you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. So I'll start sharing my screen and just walk through this. Okay, this is fairly straightforward. We, the eye, the ear, the nose, the body is not just touch, not just skin, but it is bodily sensations, right? And we have the tongue. These are obvious sense bases which we've been learning since we were little people. And the Buddha also classifies the mind. Okay, here in this graphic, we have a picture of something that looks like a brain, but the mind is not just that. Mind is the sense base, the faculty that processes all mental information. Okay, so in some ways, you can think of it as a nervous system, entire nervous system. Also, there are ways to also think about it as there are neuronal clusters that have their own behavior in your heart as well as in your gut, right? So mind is that which processes mental information. So let's use that as a definition. And essentially, these are our window to the universe. Right? So we are capable only of understanding and experiencing the universe to the extent that we are able to gain signals from these sense bases. So what we can see, certain wavelengths of light that we can't see through things like your laptop or phone screen, and we can smell certain things we can't smell as well as, for example, my dogs do. We can feel some things through touch, and all of us have different abilities with this ear, tongue, and mind. There is information that we can process, there is information that we can't process. If I was to speak in a different language that neither of you knew or that I made up in my mind, you wouldn't understand what's happening, right? So the sense basis is something important, which we'll come to, because the Buddha traces starts looking at experience from the point that there is a stimulus, right? There is information event happening. There is an visual information hitting the eye, or auditory information that is hitting the ear, or olfactory information that is hitting the nose, mental information hitting the mind, and traces what happens after that. What was underlying that also influences what happens after that information event, right? So our entire experience is related to these information events, and this structure of sense basis is something we'll touch upon when we go ahead. The one thing I wanted to specifically call out here is the mind, which is again, this is a huge topic in the scientific community as well, understanding the mind body connection. But here we are looking at mind as a base, or as a system that registers mental information. Okay, so that's what we mean by mind. And just like we might get a smell, and we have a nose, we have a sense organ that understands that kind of information. So we have, when a thought appears, right? When some information appears, it gets processed by a certain. It is incident upon a certain organ or certain information receiving system, that is the mind. Okay, so now we'll get to a very interesting thing. So the Buddha classified us as all human experience as the coming together of five aggregates. Okay, so all these are very difficult words to translate in to retaining the spirit in which they were talked about, right? And a lot of us are Indians here, so because of the Sanskrit or Hindi exposure, or your vernacular language that you might have been exposed to, you would have already some kind of a mental model of these words. So the aggregates itself is translated from kandhas in Pali, or skandha. Skandh is literally means a heap or a pile, right? So this is called an aggregate, and you can think of, so just if you look at the image on the right, so these are the ingredients for something I really enjoy, which is adrak wali chai, ginger tea, right? And it has five ingredients, and ginger tea happens because of the coming together of five ingredients. So you can think of the different heaps as things that come together to create experience, right? So what are the things that need to be present together to create the specific experience that is you experiencing the world in a moment, right? So what are the things that need to come together? So the first thing is roop or form, which is matter, everything physical, right? Physical also includes light, sound, so it's not just everything that is part of the physical world. So the other four aggregates are what you can call part of the mental world, something that would not be experienced or something that would be not exist for a inanimate object, right? And roop is something that will also be experienced by an inanimate object. So light falling on it, any other electromagnetic radiation, anything, right? So roop stands for form or matter or the physical realm. Okay, so one part of our experience is the physical realm, and when we are talking about the heaps, it can be used in both contexts. It can be you can talk about what makes up a person, but also what makes up an experience, right? So the experience is not just the matter that is constituted within what I think is me, but also what is around me. So my experience is a composite of my body sitting on a chair, right? So the environment, the matter in the environment, the matter in the world around us is also part of the aggregate of form or rupa. The second aggregate is Vedana. Vedana is feeling or sensation, right? And feeling or sensation is something that is associated with each of the, again, for both form and for Vedana. The Buddha associates them with different sense bases as well. So forms that are visible to the eye. Right? So forms that can be processed by the eye. So whether it is related to light, whether it is to a surface that can reflect light, so that is part of the so that part of the form is related to the sense base of the eye. And similarly, Vedana or feeling is, or you will also have a subclassification of Vedana which is related to the eye. So eye feeling, for instance, right? And feeling or sensation here is typically just classified in three different ways: something that is painful, something that is pleasant, and something that is neutral, neither painful, neither pleasant, right? So it is somewhere in the middle. These are the three kind of classification. And just like eye feeling, so eye feeling, for example, you may see something that is beautiful to look at, right? You may see the Taj Mahal, you may see a beautiful flower, or you may see a heap of garbage, right? So you'll get different eye feelings that are related to that. The immediate feeling. So this is a pre-conceptual feeling. So you're not identifying what is there, but you're getting a signal. So for example, if you were to touch something very hot, right? So before you know what it is that you touched, before you know whether it is searing hot or it is uncomfortable hot, there is a painful feeling that will come up. So this feeling is Vedana, right? So this is known as Vedana, and we have Vedana associated with each of the sense bases. So when sense base receives some information, processes that information, the first thing it does is it associates a feeling with it, which is either pleasant or painful, or neither pleasant nor painful. Again, the process of experience happening will break down in the coming days, but today I just want to talk about the aggregates. So the aggregate of Vedana involves everything that is related to feeling. So we have the physical world, we have feeling coming together, and then we have three more things that we'll go deeper into because Roop and Vedana, to begin with, are easier concepts to understand. The next is Sanya, is how it is called in Pali, and the Sanskrit or Hindi equivalent would be Sangya, and that is quite revealing for people who are familiar with these languages. It is often translated as perception. I prefer the translation concept, right? So it is the library of concepts that we have. It is things that we have seen and we have identified what they are and we have given it a name, right? We have a concept, in our mind, we have a definition associated with that. We have an identification associated with that. You have seen my face. Now you know what Rajiv looks like. If I were to meet you somewhere, or if I were to turn up again tomorrow, you know it's still me, right? So you have identified. Okay? So Sangya is a concept, that is, or perception. Okay, that is the third aggregate. Labels associated with things. Okay? The fourth one is very interesting. Sankhara, or in Pali, or Samskar, right, in Hindi or Sanskrit. This is a very interesting word which also has very colloquial connotations that may not be absolutely accurate, but it derives from, it's related to the word Sanskrit, right? So Sanskrit, not in the language, but Sanskriti, or the act of putting things together, the act of configuring something, right? So not the cultural part of Sanskriti, but Sanskrit is something that is put together, something that has been uh, put together in a certain way, right? And I like to, this is has a lot of translations called fabrications, formations, but I think it is easier to understand it as conditioning, right? So there is a conditioning that goes into different things. So things are also configured in a certain way, right? You may have a mug that is developed a crack in a certain way, and it is liable to fall apart in a certain way. So there is a conditioning that has gone into that, right? And similarly, we are conditioned, and we'll unpack more of this, what the conditioning is. We'll do this as later today. So this is the fourth. This gives a very personal flavor, right? Samskar, the way things are conditioned, right? Everything has its own. Like my phone would have a certain set of scratches on it. Your phone would have a different set of scratches. So they have a different way they would look, right? Similarly, I would have a certain set of conditioning. I would process information in a certain way. I would react to things in a certain way. So I have a certain conditioning which is different from yours. Okay. Anyone, can anyone help me out with where I dropped off?
You were talking about conditioning,
Okay.
specifically the difference in conditioning between
Sure.
different individuals. I think I lost you at least at the phone example. I don't know about everyone else.
Okay, great. I think uh, I didn't have anything life changing to add at that point. So we have conditioning, the way things are conditioned. Okay. And that gives the personal flavor. That defines why your experience is different from someone else's experience. Of the same, when the physical form is the same, you might have similar sensations, you might have similar concepts of the same thing, but you may have a very different reaction to it. Okay. So conditioning makes that personalized. And it is also affects the way concept as well as witness. All of these things do affect each other. And finally, we have Vinyan or Vigyan, right? So this is translated as consciousness. And again, I think there are some issues with that translation, in the sense that consciousness is used in different ways. So in many contexts, it's primarily used as, so it can be used to talk about whether somebody is awake. It can be used to talk about wakefulness, right? Conscious or unconscious, and it can also be used to talk about awareness in general, awareness of things. The specific way the Buddha uses, and we'll get to understand this in more detail, right, is something is discernment, right? And I'll talk about how that works. In fact, that's the first thing I will talk about. So every experience that you have is the coming together of this. So consciousness or discernment is information processing ability, right? So we have concepts, right? We have something physical form. We have some feeling associated with that form when there is a experience, when there is, that experience, when we encounter that certain form, like a hot stove. for instance, right? And consciousness is the ability to process that information, right? That is connected to concepts that we have, that this is a stove, this is my hand, and a burnt hand is not useful, right? So those kind of concepts are there, and conditioning, right? So somebody may jump up 2 feet in the air, right? So I'm extremely sensitive to hot things, right? Uh, so I'll probably do that if I touch something hot, and somebody is like, okay, that's fine, it's hot, so hold my drink, something like that. So people have very different reactions to that. So it is part of conditioning. So all of these coming together make up that moment of experience. How the mechanics of that work, we'll get into that later. But so that cup of tea, right? So that moment of experience is, so on a particular day you boiled the leaves, or you left it too long to brew, or you used a certain brand of tea, used a certain amount of tea. So every time, how these five ingredients come together, they determine that experience that you have in that moment. Okay. Three of the aggregates, the khandas, I want to just go into a little bit more because they're very interesting. Uh, Sangya, Sanskar, and Vigyan. Okay, so just a few examples, just to kind of keep our mind alert to what they are, because these terms are not something that we normally use in daily life. And like I mentioned, so when we talk about these things, we're talking about both internal and external form, form especially. The others are internal because they're mental, uh, part of the mental realm, how things are conditioned internally, part of things that experience, right? That we experience. Okay, starting with Vigyan, consciousness or discernment. So I have a bunch of people here. Vigyan or discernment allows you to start noticing first, differentiate the people from the background. It allows you to differentiate the hair from the skin. It allows you to differentiate the clothes from the body, differentiate that there are teeth, differentiate that people have different skin tones, that they have different body shapes, they have different facial hair. So the ability to process information, right? And they have different heights. So when you see a few people, you can see what their heights are, what is the ordering over there. So it's not about, we have still not added concepts to that, but we need this information processing to get to the point of being able to attach concepts. Now the concept might be that this is a woman, or this is somebody very athletic, or this is someone with curly hair, right? Or this is someone who may be a little overweight, right? Or this is someone is Asian, right? So those are labels that will come later, and we'll talk about that as well. Yeah, but just being able to differentiate that information, right? And not everybody will be able to make distinction, right? So, for example, if somebody is colorblind, they may not be able to differentiate between the different shades. They may have a different set of names for that. So, consciousness, and if it is green red, they may not be able to see the difference between those two at all. That discernment doesn't exist, right? So, consciousness it's processing information. It is seeing what is different from what is what, right? So what is that a human, is that a dog, so it's not naming them yet, but it is trying to understand the different elements in the environment, right? What are the different things? And now let's the labeling capability come and tell us what it is actually. Again, another example, different expressions, they may not change much, and for now we have the edge against AI in terms of being able to tell this better, because become very good over the years. Visual information is one of the biggest things that drive human understanding of the environment, right? So different expressions, being able to discern, did your joke land well, did your compliment land well? Okay. Another example of discernment, right? So popular game, Where's Waldo, right? So for kids, figuring out where Waldo is in a very messy, busy picture. So for example, your mind will start looking for things that look like humans and then try to look for certain features. Right? How does that happen? So we don't know who this is, we don't know who another person is, etc. But we know what kind of things we're looking for. So even before we get to Waldo, we are isolating parts of the uh, image that is background versus things that are humans, and maybe humans versus say uh, things, items like swords and helmets that are lying around, right? And we are eliminating that. We are discerning, and we are coming to the point where now, if I have three, if I am able to identify all the humans, I'm able to tell which one is Waldo. So where our labeling comes to help us. So Vigyan or Vijnana is the ability to distinguish between different types of information. And this is not just at the state of like understanding, so it can be a iterative process. So we went from the background to what is human versus non-human to humans that are clothed versus there are some people who are topless, and then to, somebody who's wearing maybe specs or somebody who's wearing uh, modern clothes, and you get to Waldo, right? So this is what Vigyan is, and it applies. I've given all examples, given the medium, given our bias for the visual information. I've given all examples of the eye base, but the same thing happens. So there are Vigyan. So there is Chakshur Vigyan, which is eye consciousness. There is Shrotra Vigyan, which is ear consciousness, and similarly for the tongue, for the nose, for the body, and finally for the mind, Manovigyan. So the ability to distinguish between different types of mental information, right? So fact versus myth versus lie, those kind of things. Being able to distinguish between what's useful, what's not useful, etc. Okay, so that is the aggregate of Vigyan. Now, just a few examples to illustrate what we mean by Sangya, right? So now consciousness is continuously working over time to distinguish the information that is coming into us through the environment. Okay, so here is essentially something on your screen that is a very gray, black kind of blob. But at least all the Indians here, I'm fairly certain you'll be able to identify this movement. So you can raise your hand if you're able to identify what this movement is. Right. So this is an example, right? So I mean, you are not actually seeing something, but your mind has a label. It is able to understand concepts. It is able to abstract information into concepts. So right now you're able to abstract that I'm a human being. Maybe very soon you'll have a deep fake giving the same talks, but at least for now you're able to identify this as a human being, although you are actually seeing things moving around on your screen, right? So we are able to use concepts to we add concepts to information that is coming, that our Vigyan is processing to make sense of the environment, right? So we start adding it. We know that, okay, if this, we have associated certain labels with this person, right? So am I going to pay attention to what they're saying? Am I going to believe what they're saying? Am I going to trust their intent? There are a lot of things associated with that concept. Another example, something again that we have an edge today, as of date, right? So now in this, your visual processing ability, Chakshur Vigyan, it's allowing you to identify first what that there are grids. It's allowing you to identify whether there are vehicles within the grid and what kind and the features of those vehicles. And your labeling is allowing you to say, okay, this is not just a vehicle, but this is actually a bus or it's a car, right? So you're able to make those distinctions. This is a building. So the concepts that we apply, that is Sangya. So we have information processing, which is just telling us that, okay, these are the different elements. And then we have concepts that we apply. And then from there, it can go to something that is very abstract, very layered, very temporal, and very difficult to identify with absolute certainty. So you might take a car and almost everyone will agree that it's a car, but there'll be a lot of concepts that will be very personal in your mind. So I've just given a few examples. of those words. There's a lot of fun we can have with concepts, but I'll stop there, just illustrating what Sangya or the aggregate of that. I think I've anyway. Yesterday was a heavy session, and we have more heavy sessions coming. So I thought I'll keep this one a little light. Great. Finally, Sankhara or Sanskar, right? So the first image, it's depicting the famous marshmallow test, right? So there's this famous study that was done, I think, in Stanford, where they basically put a set of, I may get a couple of details off, but I'll share the broad theme of it, right? They basically took a bunch of kids and said that, okay, I'm putting a marshmallow in front of you. If you eat it, I don't want you to eat it while I'm gone. But when I come back, if you've not eaten it, I'll give you two, something like that. So the idea is it's a test on delayed gratification, and they found that different kids had different, some kids couldn't stop, some kids would wait for a while and finally give in, and some kids would wait till they would wait for that bonus marshmallow. So why, given the same, it's exact same task, right? Same instructions, same bowl of marshmallows, same desk, same person giving the instruction. Why do people behave differently? It's related to conditioning. It is how different experiences in their life have affected their decision making. So the same information, what is the way tendency for us to process, right? And a couple of more examples, different flavors of ice cream. Each one has their diehard fans, and you cannot convince one to switch over to the other, right? And the same kind of living environment, identical rooms in a hostel, for instance, and maintained very differently. So all these are kind of personalizing how the world is coming together for an experience that is very unique to you. So these are the five aggregates. I'll just review them again. Roop or form, Vedana, feeling or sensation. So this is a pre-conceptual signal. Is this something good or bad for me? And this is very important, right? So is this something we talked about, threat and opportunity seeking behavior. So Vedana is kind of before we spend enough time. So if you're about to walk in front of a bus, before you're able to identify whether it's a car or a bus, you already have that feeling that I need to get out of the way, right? So that Vedana is pre-conceptual, that it's happening much before you actually attach concepts to what's happening. Then you have Sangya, concepts, you have conditioning or sanskar that actually makes it very personal to you, and you have Vigyan that is constantly actually making sense of the environment. The fact that, if your consciousness was not operative, the fact that there was no bus a minute back and 5 seconds back, and now there is a bus, you would not be able to figure out without constantly, scanning the environment for information and distinguishing between what's there, what's not there. So these are the five aggregates, and we'll have more fun with them. Okay, great. So that is all what I wanted to share today. Uh, any thoughts related to this? Any questions? Anything you've related to your practice that you would want to share? Feel free to share as well, and feel free to ask questions. Anything we had given a couple of exercises in the initial days. Uh, so like the marshmallow test, I'm also testing if people are accountable to themselves, or do I need to follow for that? Just kidding. But anything that came out as you practice, something that you understood about your daily life, feel free to share that, or share any question that is in your mind. Okay, I'll wait for a minute, and it's okay if there are no questions. We can have a good evening sit. Yes, Sarah. You're on mute. Yeah.
I was trying to unmute, sorry. It's a question about the talk and how you mentioned light and sound are also within form, rupa. And then you said that when light falls on something, or there might be a manifestation of sound that would also join the internal. You described internal and external, and is it that it starts to become a concept there when light falls on something?
Just give me a second, Sarah. I think there is either a problem with my earphone and just hearing it in one ear, and that's not helping me. I'll just disconnect that, and maybe I'll be able to hear you better. Just request you to repeat that question.
Do you want me to repeat or now? Okay. So you mentioned how light and sound are part of form, rupa. And then you also said they are, when light falls on something, it also is part of the internal process. And that's where I didn't hear the end of your sentence. Is it part of a concept then? For example, when we might see a shadow, so we have a concept about how the light has fallen. Is that what it wasn't said, or something else?
Yeah, so light itself is part of the physical world, right? It is external form. It is part of the external form. It is form that is perceptible by the eye, right? So light as well as absence of light. So this is all visual information. It is the field of visual information. So it includes not just light, but also objects that reflect or block light, so the way objects interact with light. So all of that information. So because what happens is when we often it's translated as material form, and a lot of people think of rupa as only things that are tangible, right? So but it's not just necessarily something that you can touch, right? So material form is essentially the physical realm, right? Physical world, not the mental process, and the rest of them being part of the mental process. So that was the distinction I was trying to tell.
Okay, so that's an example of something that would be it falls into the concept as well, because when we're visually identifying the light on an object, we're seeing the concept of a shadow, but it's also in the realm of form. Okay, I've got it. Thank you very much.
Great. Any other questions or thoughts? Again, feel free to share something interesting that you experienced also. Okay, great. So we'll take a break here. I'll see everybody for the group meditation, and just remember, I think in case you haven't, please book your check-in slot with me for tomorrow. And the group meditation, like we did today, we will start off, a lot of you are sitting for longer durations, so I don't want the 30-minute announcement of the end of that group meditation sitting to be a distraction, because a lot of you are also managing office work along with that, so you may not have multiple slots to sit. So just wanted to make a mention of that, and let's share some merit and call it a day in terms of the talk. Just give me a second. May suffering ones be suffering free.
May suffering ones be suffering free.
And the fear struck fearless be.
And the fear struck fearless be.
May the grieving shed all grief,
May the grieving shed all grief,
and may all beings find relief.
and may all beings find relief.
May all beings share this merit
May all beings share this merit
that we have thus acquired for the acquisition of all kinds of happiness.
for the acquisition of all kinds of happiness.
May enlightened beings of mighty power
May enlightened beings of mighty power
share in this merit of ours.
share in this merit of ours.
May they long protect the Buddha's dispensation.
May they long protect the Buddha's dispensation. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.